This is my project bin, and today I'm going to be going over a lot of my minor projects and acquisitions that I've had within the past few weeks relating to model railroading. First up, I have an engine that I did a little bit of work to off camera after getting it in a recent video, this Walther's Trainline FA. I got this in the video from my club's train show, where I went over everything that I bought. I believe I got this engine, like most of them, for $2.50, which was a great deal. All I really needed to do was give the connections down here, the wipers, some fresh oil, and that just made the squeaking mostly go away on this engine, and I installed some fresh Cadies instead of whatever coupler it had before. I can't actually remember. So this should mean it can actually pull some consists pretty reliably. I do have a whole bunch of other stuff from this one lot to go over. Most of it's minor work like this, but there have also been some other acquisitions because of the show. Next up, I have a model that I haven't talked about at all in many years, which is this. While you may think this is just a bobber caboose, this is my powered bobber caboose. I built this thing quite some time ago. The video on it wasn't that great, and I would like to, in the future, make a new video on this thing. That'll be something I talk about later on, but I've been doing a little bit of work. This thing was kind of light, so I added some weight to the side of it, and if you can tell, I put a disc magnet on top of here. The motor was having a little bit of problems starting and didn't seem all that great, so I just stuck a disc magnet on here to see what would happen, and it actually has made quite a significant difference. It runs much more smoothly in each direction, so I'm going to be leaving that on there, especially since it's provided some great benefits to the way this thing runs. Next up is in the Silver Streak box, and I think this is an incredibly cool piece. This is a weird combination caboose. I was actually given this car for free. Another member of the club I'm part of was given this and another piece of equipment, which you'll see later, and he immediately thought that this would be something that I could use and would be best suited for someone like me, just because of how old these things are and how odd they are. And I immediately said yes to this thing. All I really needed to do was stick on some metal wheels and some Cadies, and it's perfect. This is a really cool car. These chains are actually functional. These doors, if you can see, they slide. And I will very carefully remove this roof, which is only held in by these two ladders, which I'm actually a pretty big fan of because this car has a really nice interior. I'm not sure if I'm going to be lighting this thing, but this is an incredibly nice car. Lighting would do very well, but I really don't want to risk messing up anything in this car because, again, it's so incredibly nice, especially for an old wood kit that someone would have had to build by hand. So I don't really want to risk it, and it's just an awesome piece. I think all I want to do with this car in the future is maybe change out the lettering on the top, and other than that, I think this is going to be a really nice caboose to have in my fleet. And another thing worth mentioning, these trucks are sprung with leaf springs, which is something I've basically never seen before, and it's rather cool. It's a really unique piece, and I will love being able to use this thing with some of my steam engines. Next up is another little thing from the show. If you remember, I got this Atlas tanker. It was, again, $2.50, just like most everything from that lot. This one was really nice. This is a much newer style car. It has a copyright of 2004, so it was made in at least 2004, and all I did was I gave it some new couplers, and I put it in a nicer looking box. Even though it's a blue box, it's probably going to be safer than the odd box it had before. I'll probably stick this behind some of my modern freight power. I don't really have a huge collection of modern stuff, but it's nice to have a decent looking modern freight car that I can put behind some of my engines. Next up, I have the contents of these two boxes, and this also relates to that show recently. So when we were going through and cleaning out our layout room, another higher up member of the club actually found both of these boxes, and he actually remembered that these things had been put under the layout years ago and nobody had touched them, and it was time to get rid of them. And judging by the condition they were in, he decided that I would be the person best fit to take these things, and I am rather glad that he did. I'll start with this red box first, and if you can tell on the side, this is a brass Heisler. This thing is in far from perfect shape. It's got a lot of paint chips. However, the detail on this thing is really good, and the weight is really good as well. This engine does not run very well, so I think this might actually be a future restoration video for the channel, which would be really cool. But this is a really nice looking engine, and I believe these are kind of valuable. I don't ever plan to sell this thing. I want to put DCC and sound in it at some point, as well as a new motor, and I've got the motor I would like to use in the box already. So I've already got all the parts and pieces I need. The shell is also off, so I'll need to screw that into place. And this coupler looks very droopy, so I think I'll need to do some coupler work on this thing. But overall, this is an incredibly nice looking model, and I would love to get this thing operating well, maybe give it some fresh paint and some decals, and use it for ages and ages. And in the next box is another brass engine, but before that, this box is just genuinely really cool. It's not the box that belongs to the engine, it belongs to one of these other contents in here, but this is a really classic and unique looking box, and I love the thing. But in here we have both a bobber caboose and a little 040. First off, I'll talk about this bobber caboose. This is an old Mantua bobber caboose, which is what this box actually went to. I did a little bit of work and I actually put some Cadies and metal wheels on this car. So this thing can actually run up to standards on the club's track, which is really cool. It's a really unique looking car. I know it's rather old, but I still think it's a really nice piece that I can use behind some of my locking engines and maybe put some decals on in the future. The other piece from this box is another brass engine, but this one's a little teeny tiny 040T. Both of these engines, both the Heisler and this, look kind of like they were narrow gauge at first, but these are actually standard gauge locomotives, which is rather cool, so I can actually use them. This one does not have a headlight, but it's a really unique thing. I do want to order this one a new motor, but the motor on this one's really short, so I have to find a good motor that will actually fit in here. This one, again, does not run very well, just like that Heisler. Both these engines have really high current draw, and before changing out the motors, I want to see if we can fix that in a future video. So I'll put these away, and we'll go on to something else that isn't brass. Next up, I've done quite a lot of work to this Mantua F7 off camera. I actually had two of these that's been consolidated down to one. So I had one that had a bad power truck, but it didn't have a weight, and the front truck was kind of janky, and the shell was in rather rough shape. And then I had this one, which had a bad power truck, but everything else good. So all I did was I took the power truck out of the other one, and took the power truck out of this one, and then just swapped them. The other one was kind of a junky engine, so I had already gotten rid of that one, but this one already has a Cadie on the back, it runs really well, and I believe I added a neodymium magnet to make this thing run even better, so this should be a nice smooth runner that I can keep around. It'll have really good weight, and it won't have any odd issues with it. So instead of having two rather rough engines, I've just got one good one. Next up, I have two final pieces of rolling stock to go over from the show that I mentioned a lot this video. First off is this lifelike Penn Central boxcar, or not Penn Central, New York Central boxcar. Penn Central was later. I've actually put on some Cadies and some metal wheels. I believe this already had metal wheels, so maybe just Cadies, and the weight was already up to standard, nothing much crazy. I will say, with a lot of these older kits, like this Lifelike car and some of those branchline kits I've been building, I hate these stirrups. They are always so fragile and prone to breaking. This one literally broke just by me opening the box and taking it out the first time, which is a little bit absurd. I've been replacing on a lot of these stirrups with brass stirrups that I have laying around, so I want to start doing that to all these cars, but it really annoys me how fragile they are because they're a part that gets bumped around a lot, and on a lot of newer cars I don't seem to be having this issue. And then the other piece, if you may remember, it's this nickel plate road hopper. This box is kind of absurdly big for this car, but I've done a few things. I put on some metal wheels and some Cadies, and all of this height is up to standard, and I also added on this coal load. I had a whole bunch of these laying around, and while it's a little bit short, this one happened to be almost the exact size needed for this car, so I think it works pretty well, and it's a pretty nice looking car that I can put with my B&O units, like I mentioned in the original video. Alright, next up I wanted to talk about this odd thing. You may have seen me fail to restore this in a past video, not a future video. This is a future video, but yeah, this one, as you can see, its whole rear truck is missing. I have parted that out and removed it. However, I do want to talk about what I'm doing with this thing and what I do with a lot of my models sort of like this that are going to need parts. I have a specific project bin for these more long-term projects, and I have my own sort of set of rules for these. So I'll put this thing aside, and I'll talk about this bin a little bit more and bring it up here. While you can't see all of it, this is the bin that I'm talking about. This is where all my much more long-term projects go. It's either a lot of big parts and whatnot, things that I want to work on in the future and haven't gotten around to, or things that actually do need parts. So some of these things that I've gotten here are mostly future projects, like I've got a just project, I believe, parting out Bowser locomotive. And I also have this Varney 460, which is in here because I would like to repaint it and do a lot of detail work, and I just need to get the parts to do that. It's not like I'm missing any parts or anything's broken, I just need to find the time and the parts to get this thing done, and I would like to do that in a future restoration video, but for the most part, it's just little things I want to fix up or use somewhere, somehow, And after a set amount of time, especially if it isn't something I want, I just try and purge this bin and get rid of a whole bunch of stuff. So I usually give this stuff 6 months to a year to sit in here, and if I can't figure out something to do with it, or I don't have any plan or anything for it, or any desire to keep whatever it is, I get rid of it. And there's a few things that I am actually getting rid of from this bin, which I do kind of want to talk about because I don't really ever mention this, and it's a lot of my more rough projects like this that really aren't worth very much. So what I do with these things usually is I'll give them to a friend, part them out, and if I can't get someone who wants to take it or use it for anything at all, it usually ends up just getting thrown out. And this is a very last resort. I don't just throw a whole bunch of stuff out. This is only stuff I can't actually get rid of and no one else wants, and this is stuff that doesn't really have much value at all to it. Alright, so I've got exactly 7 of these things that I'm planning to get rid of, the first of which is this Athearn Hustler. And the reason for this one is it doesn't have anything in here. These motor mounts were both completely gone, and while I know I could get new motor mounts, I already have a bunch of these things that work pretty well, and this one isn't anything ecstatic or interesting at all. What I did want to do with one of these at some point was turn one of them into a B unit. I saw someone somewhere on some forum that did that once, and it actually looked really cool. However, I just don't think I have the desire to have a B unit Hustler anymore. They're cool engines, and the B unit one that I saw, again, was rather cool, but I really don't think I need one in my fleet. I have no desire to own one, so this is a project I'm going to get rid of, especially since I really don't think getting new motor mounts, a motor, all of that stuff for this thing is really going to be worth it. Next up is a shell that I've had sitting around for a while, which is the Southern Pacific GE 70-tonner shell. This was actually the engine I pulled out of the trash can several years ago and rebuilt. I have the actual engine itself to this day. However, another member of the club I go to, the same one who gave me those brass steamers from earlier, had a spare one of these shells laying around from when I originally got the thing running, and he gave it to me nicely. So I had this one laying around. I had some potential plans of kit bashing for it and whatnot, but at this point it's been over 3 years, which is a lot longer than I usually like stuff sitting in that bin, so I think it's time for this one to finally go have a new home somewhere, hopefully. And then I actually have another diesel locomotive shell I'm getting rid of, which is this GN GP9 shell. I got this one, again, about 2 years ago, and I've never really had a use for it. I did want to make some weird kit bash, like switcher locomotive CN had, but I decided against it because it would be too much effort. There's some people who actually produce the shells online already, and I just don't think my result would be as good of something I could just buy for a similar price point to what I'd be building it as. Next up, I've got a really weird piece of rolling stock. We have this custom transfer caboose. I got this thing in a lot of stuff that the club I was part of was just going to throw out, which seems to be a common theme around here, but this thing is in rather rough shape. I had a goal of trying to see if I could turn this into a nicer looking transfer caboose. However, with a lot of my recent caboose acquisitions, I just don't think I really need a transfer caboose. Even if I could turn this into something really nice with how it looks, which I would actually want to do, I just don't have the time, and I have cabooses that are already something I would rather have more than just this weird transfer caboose. So this, I'll see if another friend can use, just like a lot of this other stuff, see if there's something that can be done with it, because in the end, I don't really want to throw stuff out, but this one's really not of high quality to begin with. Next up is actually something from that same lot. This is a really weird Baltimore and Ohio wood snowplow. While this thing's rather cool, I already have snowplows. I don't really have a need for this one. And with the detailed damage it has and a lot of this truck work and the lack of weight of this thing, I believe it would need a full rebuild, which I really just don't have the time to deal with, nor do I really have the desire for the outcome it would have. So this thing, I think I'm going to be getting rid of it. Again, it is still a really cool piece. It's just not something that I have the time to put the energy into that would actually make it turn out to be something really nice. I know someone could, but right now with my other projects, I'm not the person who desires to turn this thing into something nice. Next up is something that may look like a pile of parts, but it's actually an engine I tried to restore on this channel quite some time ago, and I've actually owned for even longer than that. This is the remains of a Varney 040. This thing was bad because it had bad quartering. I believe one of the tires itself is cracked, and the entire frame was zinc rotted. I waited around, I hunted for frames. I really could not find any in a timely manner, and at this point, with the amount of other steamers I have, I don't really think I have the need to hunt down, custom build a frame, or anything like that to try and rebuild it. The amount of parts here and what it's got just doesn't seem like it'll be enough to rebuild this thing nicely. So I'm going to see if I can save some of these parts, because it's Varney. You don't come across these things every day. But this one, I just don't have the desire to find the part, even if I did find the part, I really don't have the need to rebuild it into anything, and a lot of these other parts are in rough shape, so it doesn't really feel like it's worth it to. Lastly, I have another really unique piece that I actually like, but I don't really have the time to turn into something good. This is a fully die-cast crane. I was given this by a former member of the club I'm part of, I believe over a year ago at this point. This thing is really cool, it's rather heavy, and I really did want to turn this into something special. However, I have so many cranes at this point, I really don't need to spend the time devoting this to becoming the perfect ultimate crane when I have some nicer cranes. And really, I just don't think it would be that useful. It's so heavy that no engine could really pull this thing. It could be a nice display piece for someone, I don't know, but I really don't have the need for this thing. It is, again, really nice. I just don't see myself rebuilding this thing. And even if I did put the time and energy into rebuilding it, I don't see myself actually using it, which is why I'm not going to be putting that effort into it. Before we go much further, I wanted to give all 5 of these engines a quick little test run. We'll start with the Mantua F7. You can see this thing after that work runs pretty well. Next up we have the Bobber Caboose, and while I was talking about how I wanted to make a video of this thing in the future, what my overall plan is I want to make a video about all of my mildly interesting locomotives once I build a new layout. So that'll basically mean as soon as I have the time and the resources, I would like to build a new layout similar to my old one. I would like to be able to have a nice-ish looking layout in my minimal amount of space, and have enough scenery to run trains and have some pretty good clips and make some decent videos out of it. So let me give this thing some power and we'll test it out. Of course, this is the time it doesn't want to start. There it goes. It's a little... There it goes. This thing's pretty quick too, so it's a rather fun thing to have around, and I would love to talk about it more in the future. Lastly, of the working engines, we have the Walthers Trainline engine. And this thing runs just about perfectly. It takes a little bit of warm up for it to actually start, but once it does, it runs pretty smoothly. First up of the brass engines, I have the Heisler. I'll give this thing quite a bit of power, because this one does not actually run really well. As you can tell, it is moving, it's just rather stuttery, and I've found trying to run this thing a little bit more, it likes to have a really high current draw and make my controller have its safety shut off. And last of the engines to test, we have the little dinky 040. This one also has the same high current draw problem. However, this one actually runs, and if you can tell, it is pretty noisy. With that bin out of the way, I still have a few more things to go through, because I still have a few more pieces of equipment, all of which that I got for free. First off, it's in this real vintage Varney box, which is rather cool. It's in really nice shape. We have an old Varney reefer. I've actually done my research, and I believe this was built in about 1949. I believe that's when they started offering this paint scheme. So it would be late 40s, early 50s. At least I believe that's what I've discovered from the research I've done. This thing does not have all of the original parts, but I do want to put some Katie's metal wheels on this thing, and maybe put this thing on a consist. Although, I am considering talking to some other members of the club I'm part of, because we have a display of vintage stuff like this, and especially with this original box, even in imperfect shape, I think this is something that could actually go into that display, because it's something rather old and unique. So I'll probably talk to someone before I go in and dive into working on this thing, but we'll see. If I don't keep this thing, it might become a museum piece. And if it doesn't become a museum piece, I'm absolutely keeping it around. Alright, next up I have a whole bunch of free blue box cards to go over, and by a whole bunch, I mean there's 4 of them. There are actually a few more. I did get a reefer and I believe a gondola that I've already built up. They aren't of anything of note, but I got them in the same way as all these other cars. They're not going to be featured here though. But my club has a whole bunch of these blue box cards and just wanted them gone. So after the show, they've been giving out a whole bunch of these things for free, and I've gotten, I believe, 6 of them, and here I'm going to show you 4 of them. First up, in this pretty big box, we have this trailer on flat car. It's not perfect. You can see there's some glue residue on here. I don't really care that much. All I've really done is put some Katie's on this thing. Actually, I think I only put this Katie on. This one was already here, surprisingly. And I've been using this thing. I don't think I'm going to keep it around for that long, but it was a fun little thing to build. In here, I can't remember what exactly is in each of these. This is an ATSF maintenance away gondola. I have my ATSF crane, and I think this would be a car that can go pretty well with that consist. I have some future plans for it. This thing's going to need new Cadies, metal wheels, obviously, and then I can probably throw this thing on my work train. I need to get an engine and some other stuff for that sorted out, but I would love to have a semi-decent ATSF work train being built. Next up, this should be the 40-foot REA reefer, which it is. This one is just your basic Athearn Blue Box 40-foot reefer in the REA livery. Somehow I've never owned an REA car before, so this is something new for me. This one has some indoor weathering on the roof, as I like to call it, just some dust and buildup from being inside. This one, again, will need some weight, Cadies, and metal wheels for it to be a good car. And the last piece for this entire video, we have another high cube boxcar. This one's a Burlington car. So far I've got 2 of these, and I think a third is going to be a pretty good addition to my 70s and 80s consist. This one I believe is a 67 car. It feels like this one's got some really good weight. I believe all I want to do is give this thing some new couplers. On one end it's got a Cadie, and on the other end it's got this weird cheap plastic coupler. I want to replace both because neither feel all that great. These trucks will need a little bit of work, but other than that, I think this car is almost going to be good to go. So that's all of the projects and acquisitions that I have had recently, and I want to thank you all for watching. Hopefully you'll see some of these projects appear in some future videos as well.